What's going on, y'all? Today I got a special treat for y'all. Got Josh Lim that's going to be on the channel talking about his speckled trout rigs and his setup, so on and so forth. If y'all don't know Josh Lim, he was a pretty successful charter captain guide down around the Pensacola area, and he's moved to Galveston, so I'm going to link up with him. And without further ado, we'll go ahead and get into it and talk about his trout rigs.
How's it going, guys? I'm Captain Josh with www.limitoucharters.com. Coming to you from Houston, Texas, more specifically the Galveston area. I was a full-time guide in Pensacola, Florida. Y'all may have heard of it, maybe not, but Limit Out Charters, where I established myself as being a very well-known inshore captain. And you know, one of my biggest loves for fishing is speckled trout fishing, more importantly, big trout fishing. Growing up on the California Delta, I targeted a lot of largemouth bass. Growing up with my dad and other family members, my uncle, you know, they were tournament fishermen, so I kind of grew up in that scenery. And then when I joined the Navy at the age of 18, they brought me to Pensacola, Florida, and that's when I decided to be a full-time guide. And I implemented all my bass techniques, even rods and reels, lures as well, into the inshore fishery, and you know, it just kind of blossomed from there. But now I am here in the Galveston complex, and as many of you may know, there's a lot of really big trout here in the Galveston complex. And today I want to go over just some of my rods and reels along with the lures in which I'm using to target these big speckled trout. And a lot of you may realize that, well, it's just bass fishing 101, and we're going to implement it here at the Galveston complex. So one of the first things I want to go over is my jig rod. Now you will notice that all my rods are spinning rods. I do like throwing bait casters. I feel like they're very ergonomically sound. They're very comfortable to hold, but I find that spinning tackle holds up a little bit better in the salt. They definitely have more line, which allows you to cast a little bit further. And well, it's just easier to use, you know, when you're casting into the wind. I feel like in the saltwater industry, we make a lot more long casts, which is paramount inshore fishing than it is bass fishing. Bass fishing is a lot of short pitches. You know, you're basically fishing 20 feet at the most ahead of you. Inshore fishing, the longer you can cast, the better. With that being said, braid is paramount. Braid is on all of my rods. I like to stick with the 15-pound test braided line unless I'm using my bait casters. I'll put on 30-pound test. Also leaders. You know, growing up in the Pensacola area as a guide, we always use fluorocarbon. You know, going from a clear water fishery to a dirty water fishery, I feel the need for fluorocarbon is still there. If it gets me 1 or 2 extra bites, so be it. But I feel like if you are going to target big speckled trout, you might as well go ahead and start throwing a fluorocarbon leader. One of the biggest questions I get a lot of times is how long of a leader, what pound test, and what knot to tie from your braid to your fluorocarbon. Go ahead and answer all that for you. I like to use 17 to 20 pound test fluorocarbon, and I attach my braid to my fluoro with an Albright knot. Unless I'm in really windy conditions or it's dark, I'll go ahead and tie the uni to uni if I'm in a hurry. Other than that, leader size, I basically, now this one's a little short because I've been using it, and when I say short, it's about 6 feet long. I like to have my knot, well, nope, this is brand new, we're good to go. So I like to have my knot right above my reel when I'm gonna make a cast, okay? That's how long of a leader I have. So it kind of depends on whether you're using a 7-foot or a 7'6". Well, it kind of depends, but regardless of how long or short your rod is, I want the knot to be right above my reel when my lure is hanging to make a cast. So as long as possible. Something else to go over is lures. Lure selection and rod selection kind of go hand in hand once you start getting dialed in as to what size jigs you like to throw. And for the most part, I like to throw a 3/8 ounce jig regardless of depth. You know, as long as I'm not fishing over 15 feet, I'll stick to a 3/8 ounce regardless of how shallow I am. So 15 to 0 feet, I'm throwing a 3/8 ounce most of the time. Reason being is it gives me a really long cast. We go back to that long cast deal. I just feel the more water I can cover in a given day, the more fish I'm gonna present my lure to, and the more fish I'm gonna ultimately catch. But another thing a 3/8 ounce does is it allows you to work your jig very vigorously. With that being said, we're gonna go into the rod action. The faster the rod, fast as in the action in which the tip has, so the stiffer the tip, the more action you're gonna get out of your lure without having to overwork yourself. That rod is gonna lift that lure immediately when you're using a fast to extra fast rod. This so happens to be a 7'1" heavy, extra fast rod. That's my jigging rod. I pair it up with a 3000 size reel, again 15-pound braid, and this is 17-pound test fluorocarbon, so a 6 to 7 foot leader attached by an Albright knot. That's my jig setup. My next setup, let's talk about jerk baits, twitch baits. Okay. Whenever you want to work the middle of the water column, and there's different types of hard baits, some will rise slowly, some will sink slowly, some will suspend. But whenever you're throwing hard baits, I feel like it's paramount to throw a rod that has a lot more cushion at the tip. Okay, so a slower action rod. Now I don't want it to be too slow, I consider it to be moderate. Something in the medium range, okay? To where that rod has plenty of give at the tip. Okay, compared to my jigging rod, it is very soft. But it is a moderate action rod, medium action. It's a 7-foot rod. And again, my leader is as long as possible. 17-pound fluorocarbon, 15-pound braid attached by that Albright knot to a 3000 size reel. Okay. So that's my hard bait setup. Now let's get a little bit more fundamental as far as where we're at. Houston, Texas, Galveston Complex. Corkies. Okay. Very, very popular in this area. They cover a lot of water. You can cast them a country mile is one of the things I love about it. It's a slow sink descent. It has a nice little wobble. But with that being said, I use this lure to power fish. Even though it sinks very slow, I use it to cover a lot of ground. Or if I feel like the fish are spooky, if I'm in a shallow area and I need to make a really long cast, this setup allows me to cast this Corky a country mile. I mean, a bait caster cannot cast this as far as I can cast because it just doesn't have that much line. Line capacity with this setup I think is a big deal. So only rod on my deck that is a 4000 size reel, and reason being is because I want that extra line capacity. Not to say that I'm going to cast this lure 350 yards, but the more line you have on your reel, the less resistance that line is going to feel as it's coming off of your spool. Okay, so the bigger spool you have, the more line, it allows that line to come off your reel more freely, thus having a longer cast. Now on all these reels, it's 15-pound test braid. On this reel, even though it's a bigger reel, my 4000 size, it's actually 10-pound test. So I'm using a bigger spool plus a slightly smaller diameter paired to a 7'6" rod. So I'm also using a longer rod. The longer rod, the bigger reel, the more line capacity, the thinner diameter line is basically my equation to getting this thing out a country mile. How far does it cast? I'm not sure, but I've had people at bait casters try to cast about as far as I cast. I'm telling you, it's double or more. This rod, my Corky rod, is a 7'6" rod, fast action. But because it's a 7'6", even though it's a fast action, I still got a nice little cushion there. I feel it's paramount to have that cushion whenever you're using treble hook lures. That is my Corky setup. And then last but not least, this rod right here, I like to throw things such as a fluke, swim baits, line through swim baits. Anytime where I feel like I need to get slightly finessey, yet still have a fast action rod, this is when I switch up to this. This is a 7-foot medium fast action rod paired to a 3000 size reel, kind of your standard action rod reel combo for inshore. Got it tied to a fluke right now. It's a weedless application. Great for throwing around oysters, grass. You know, whenever you're fishing inshore, we're always dealing with grass, oysters, and there's a time and place to throw a weedless deal. Make sure you got that in your box. This faster action rod tip allows me to really set that hook into a fish, really drive that hook into the fish's mouth. That's why I use the fast action rod for this particular setup. But those are my setups. Occasionally I'll go ahead and throw a topwater lure onto my jerkbait setup. Reason being is because it has that extra cushion on top for that rod tip. Again, moderate taper, but it's paramount that I think you use or have a jig rod, a twitch bait rod or jerkbait rod, and a topwater rod. As long as you have enough rods on board your boat or your kayak to basically fish all parts of the water column, you're doing right. And these are the rods and reels in which I like to use